So trust me, I did not want to be the scientist that studies self-love and kindness because I wanted to do, harder science. I mean, that sounds so soft and squishy, but it's what works. And as a clinical psychologist, it is literally the secret sauce that transforms people. That when people practice mindfulness without kindness, it just doesn't work. They just end up sitting there judging themselves even more. And so what we're finding is that self-compassion, kindness is essential. Now, I want to be clear. This doesn't mean that you lie to yourself. This doesn't mean you make a huge mistake and you're like, oh, sweetheart, it's fine. What it means, your brain and nervous system aren't stupid. They know if you've messed up. So what it means is with your mindfulness, you see clearly your mistake and then you're on your own team. How can I repair this? What do I need to do next time? And that's really the power of self-compassion.
Today's guest is Dr. Shauna Shapiro. She's a PhD and best-selling author, clinical psychologist, and internationally recognized expert in mindfulness and self-compassion. She's a professor at Santa Clara University and has published over 150 papers and 3 critically acclaimed books, translated into 16 languages. Dr. Shapiro has presented her research to the King of Thailand, the Danish government, Bhutan's Gross National Happiness Summit, and the World Council for Psychotherapy, as well as to Fortune 100 companies, including Google, Cisco Systems, and LinkedIn. Her work has been featured in the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, Oprah, NPR, and The American Psychologist. Her TEDx talk, The Power of Mindfulness, has been viewed over 3.5 million times. I'm so excited to have you here, Dr. Shapiro. Welcome to Take Back Your Health, Dr. Amy Myers. All right. Well, welcome, Shauna Shapiro. I'm so nice to meet you and excited to meet you. And today we're going to be talking about mindfulness, which is something I think that we could all use a bit more of. So I like to kind of start things with just your background and, who you are, how you came to be, and, how you really got into mindfulness.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I'm a professor at Santa Clara University, and I've been a scientist and researcher for the past 25 years. But my entry into mindfulness was when I was quite young. I was 17 years old, and I had spinal fusion surgery. So I had a metal rod put in my spine because my scoliosis, the curvature of my spine, had curved so much it was going to puncture my lungs. So we had to kind of operate pretty immediately. And this was a very, very hard time, if you can imagine. I actually have 4 teenagers right now. And when I think of any of them having to go through this, it breaks my heart. So I had been captain of the volleyball team. I just signed to play at Duke University. My whole life was volleyball. And I ended up, in a hospital bed for 6 months. I never played volleyball again. And at 17, I just didn't have the tools to cope. So I became really depressed, really anxious. And luckily, that's when I was introduced to mindfulness. And I remember I was given a book by Dr. John Kabat-Zinn on mindfulness. And the very first sentence said, whatever's happened to you, it's already happened. The only thing that matters is now what? And it was as if this path kind of opened up for me. Like there was hope, there was possibility. And so I started reading everything I could about mindfulness. And a few years later, once I was healthier, I went to Thailand to study mindfulness and ended up at a monastery there for a few months. And what I experienced there had such a huge impact on me. By the end of the 3 months, I felt a sense of peace that I'd never felt before. And nothing had changed on the outside. I still had back surgery. I was still in pain, but something so essential had changed on the inside. So when I came back to the US, I got my PhD and became a professor. And I've pretty much spent the last 25 years studying and researching mindfulness.
Well, I mean, I'm very sorry that you went through that. And yes, I can not imagine doing that at all, but certainly as a teenager, such informative years and pressures and wow, your whole career. So, but how incredible that none of your external circumstances changed, but you really just changed your internal environment and your mindset.
Yeah.
So for those, I mean, I feel like mindfulness is a little bit of a buzzword. What, can we just dive into what exactly, maybe what is your definition of it? What, how do you think of mindfulness as you're teaching this to others?
Yeah, I completely agree. It has become very popular, very much a buzzword. And when I started, 30 years ago, no one had really heard of it. And so I think with its popularity has come some maybe dilution of the essence of what it is. So I've spent a lot of my academic career defining mindfulness. And at its essence, it's about attention. It's about just focusing your attention in the present moment. And for those of you listening, you might notice that's kind of hard to do, right? The mind wanders off, and it actually wanders about 47% of the time. That's from research at Harvard. So the average person's mind is wandering about half of your life. So the first part of mindfulness is just stabilizing your attention in the present moment. But so really mindfulness is about being able to train and stabilize our attention and to bring it back. So your mind will wander off. It'll wander off to sound. It'll wander off to thoughts. It'll wander off to emotions. But we have the capacity to bring it back. And what that does is it means it puts us back in choice. And I really think that our attention is the most valuable resource we have. Where you put your attention and the quality of your attention determines the quality of your life. So that's the foundation of mindfulness. But where it becomes a bit more nuanced is you have to know, why am I paying attention? Like, what do I care about? We have so many options of where to put our attention. So I define that as your intention, which is, why am I paying attention? What do I care about? And then there's, how am I paying attention? And that's the attitude. Am I paying attention in a judgmental, critical way? Or am I paying attention with kindness and with curiosity? So my simple definition of mindfulness has these three elements: your intention, your attention, and your attitude. And it's really about the awareness that arises when I'm intentionally focusing my attention with kindness.
And now, how does this practice differ from, say, a meditative practice?
Great question. So the biggest confusion that I always like to answer first is mindfulness and meditation are different. Mindfulness is a way of being that hopefully we're practicing as I'm speaking, as you're listening. Meditation is the exercise. It's like going to the gym and lifting weights so that when I come home, I can pick up my child, right? So we go to the gym to do the exercise that strengthens our capacity to be mindful throughout the day. So mindfulness is this moment-to-moment way of being. I can eat mindfully, I can walk mindfully, I can shower mindfully, and meditation is the practice.
And when you say mindful, is it more of a just being present? But it sounds like it's more than that, because you could be present and irritated, or you could be present and be in gratitude.
Right. And so yes, it's about how you're present, because a sniper could be the most mindful person in the world. They know how to pay attention. So it has to be your intention, your attitude. Now I want to clarify, because you said you could be present and irritated. That could still be mindful, right? It's not about pretending to be happy or grateful all the time. Maybe I'm being present with my irritation in a kind way. And that's the nuance, because what's really interesting is when you're paying attention with this kind of curiosity and kindness to your sadness, to your fear, to your anxiety, it actually changes everything. Does that make sense? So we're not forcing ourselves to be kind of toxically positive. We're actually allowing ourselves to be present with however things are without judging or shaming ourselves for it.
And so when you're teaching this, are you solely focused on sort of that end result? You mentioned you correlated it to going to the gym and then picking up your child, practicing to pick up your child. Are you mostly just focused on the picking up of your child, or are you incorporating also the practice of the meditation in order to be able to then pick up your child with the mindfulness?
Right. So the meditation, and what I encourage people is to start a daily practice, because what we found is about 5 minutes a day, 5 days a week, you have to start to see changes in your brain. So as we have a daily practice, again, I call this mental fitness training, right? Just like we can train our physical body, we can train our mind. And so by training the mind, what that means is that I'm more present in my day.
Mm-hmm.
And what mindfulness does is it simultaneously cultivates this laser-like attention. So I have clarity. We've shown that your memory improves, your processing speed improves. You're able to learn and integrate material more effectively. But at the same time as I have this laser-like attention, my body's at ease. I'm calm. So it's this really interesting juxtaposition of this relaxed alertness that I can start to bring throughout my day. And that's why athletes are using it. That's why top executives are using it, right? That's why doctors are using it, is so that we can train the mind in this particular state of consciousness.
And so when you were in Nepal, and that's where you spent 3 months originally after your surgery and sort of getting into this.
I was in a monastery in Thailand, but
oh, in Thailand. Okay, excuse me. I'm sorry. Yeah. Well, I'm sorry. I have here Thailand and Nepal. Was it?
I did some trekking through the monasteries in Nepal, but the meditation training was in Thailand.
Okay. So, I mean, can you just go a little bit deeper about, exactly what you were doing during that 3 months? Because I think a lot of people hear monastery, meditation, maybe they're thinking, you spent 3 months in silence. I don't know what people are thinking.
It's a great question. And I do want to be really cautious to say, you do not need to go to Thailand or Nepal, and you do not need to go to a monastery, and you do not need to spend months in silence. That's why this research out of Stanford is so exciting, because you just need to practice 5 minutes a day, 5 days a week. So I want to be really clear. My experience is unique, but not necessary. Mm-hmm. So the way that the training worked, it was kind of like going to boot camp, like a very intensive training. And we would wake up at 4 a.m. every morning. It would be dark out, and you'd go right into the meditation hall, and you were in silence. And you'd spend the day alternating between practicing sitting meditation, practicing walking meditation. And then also, I hear the garbage truck again, but we'll just notice it, bring our mind back.
Release, yes.
And then you would practice kind of mindfully eating at the meals. And it was really about turning your attention inward. So there was no conversation with the outside world at all. And what was interesting is when I first got to the monastery, I was pretty excited, right? Like I had been reading about mindfulness for years. I was so excited to be there. And these were, real monks and a real monastery and real meditation cushions. And I just had this idea in my mind that everything was going to just be really peaceful and blissful for me. And after a few days, I realized I was anxious. I was frustrated. My mind was wandering all over the place. I couldn't focus. And I really started judging myself. Like, you're terrible at this. What's wrong with you? I even started judging the monks. Like, why are they just sitting here? Shouldn't they be trying to save the world? And luckily, a monk arrived who spoke English. And as I shared with him my struggles and my frustration in this 20-minute interview I had with him, the only time that you got to speak, he looked at me and he said, "Oh, you're not practicing mindfulness. You're practicing judgment, impatience, frustration." And then he said these 5 words that I will never forget. He said, "What you practice grows stronger." Mm-hmm. And we know this now with neuroplasticity. Our repeated thoughts, emotions, behaviors, they shape our brain. And he said, if you're meditating with judgment, you're just growing judgment, right? That mindfulness has to do with paying attention with kindness. So that's the first time I really got that nuance of how we're paying attention. And as I began to pay attention with kindness, the practice changed. So, for example, I was still in pain. I'd still had back surgery. But instead of hating my pain or, denying my pain or pushing it away, I would welcome it with kindness. Like, "Oh, sweetheart, you're in pain." Or, "I missed my parents." It was my first time ever out of the country and alone away from them. And I remember once really missing my mom. And instead of saying, "Oh, you baby," I was like, "Oh, sweetheart, you miss your mom." So as I started to practice in that way, everything changed. And that, I believe, is really how that sense of peace at the end of the retreat arose. Even though I still missed my parents and my back still hurt, there was this sense of okayness that I'd really never had before.
Yeah. I mean, I feel that we don't give ourselves enough compassion, and probably, if most people are like me, and it sounds like you at the beginning of your practice, at least, that we're very judgmental, and particularly of our own selves. So, I went through transcendental meditation training right after my freshman year of college. I came home and my mother saw how stressed I was. And, I've done that on and off, but I do think that my thoughts get in the way. I recently have done a couple of retreats with Joe Dispenza and his meditations, which have been a bit easier for me to get in that, headspace. But I think the point of all of this is I can only speak to myself. I'm, very judgmental of myself and have only, recently learned about, loving compassion and kindness towards myself and, saying those things like, it's okay, Amy, or I love you, Amy, things like that, that really, frankly, change our chemistry inside of our body.
Yeah, I'm so glad you're bringing this up because so when I came back from Thailand, this whole idea of being kind to yourself, treating yourself with kindness was new for me. And I became a clinical psychologist. I started working with a lot of different people. I worked with women with breast cancer. I worked with veterans. I worked with stressed out college students and high-level executives and, people from very different walks of life. And everyone was saying the same thing as you, which is, I beat myself up. I'm hard on myself. This kind of real deep internal critic that just doesn't even go away. It's just constantly judging. And so I became kind of interested in what happens when we judge ourselves. Like, does it make me do better in school? Does it make me a better mother? And what I discovered is that shame, self-judgment doesn't work. Mm-hmm. It can't work. It literally, just like you said, it changes your physiology. It shuts down the learning centers of the brain and shuttles your resources to survival pathways and literally keeps you stuck in the very behaviors that you were judging yourself for. And this is where this attitude of kindness comes in. Because as you just said, kindness shifts your neurochemistry. So when we're kind to ourselves, first of all, it releases oxytocin, which is this hormone of safety, which is really important to kind of settle our nervous system so that we can learn. Kindness also releases dopamine, which is this neuromodulator of motivation and learning. It literally turns on the learning centers of the brain. And so trust me, I did not want to be the scientist that studies self-love and kindness because I wanted to do, harder science. I mean, that sounds so soft and squishy, but it's what works. Mm-hmm. And as a clinical psychologist, it is literally the secret sauce that transforms people. That when people practice mindfulness without kindness, it just doesn't work. They just end up sitting there judging themselves even more. And so what we're finding is that self-compassion, kindness is essential. Now, I want to be clear. This doesn't mean that you lie to yourself. This doesn't mean you make a huge mistake and you're like, oh, sweetheart, it's fine. What it means, your brain and nervous system aren't stupid. They know if you've messed up. So what it means is with your mindfulness, you see clearly your mistake and then you're on your own team. How can I repair this? What do I need to do next time? And that's really the power of self-compassion.
And and then what physiologically happens? Can you explain that to us as we're doing that?
Right. So that's what I was just describing. So when I say, oh, sweetheart, you're disappointed in how that went,
then the dopamine and the
oxytocin and the dopamine, this kind of chemical cocktail that literally puts me in an environment where I can change. Right. That's the goal. The goal is not perfection. It's not to do everything right. The goal is learning and evolution. Mm-hmm. Perfection's the antithesis of evolution. Perfection means I'm done. That's not the goal. And so when I make a mistake, instead of beating myself up, it's like, how can I learn? How can I grow? And you're cheering for yourself instead of kicking yourself when you're already down.
And, have you done any research or seen, where in terms of, say, chronic illness, it's much harder for these things to grab hold, when we're in this state with, the dopamine being released and, I would say a parasympathetic state, right? Versus the sympathetic state where, maybe more chronic diseases are coming out and things like that.
So I would say people with chronic illness and most people in general are in a sympathetic state, that most people are in a survival mode. And so when I work with patients and all of the research that I've done focuses on how do we first regulate our own emotions? How do we take care of ourselves? The first part of self-compassion is just naming that we're in pain.
Mm-hmm.
And what's interesting is when you name an emotion, when you say, I'm scared or I'm overwhelmed, it actually starts to calm down our physiology. They did a great study at UCLA where they showed that just naming the emotion activates the prefrontal cortex and helps people calm down. So the first step is just to say, I'm scared, right? And then the next step is to treat yourself like you would treat a dear friend, right? Sweetheart, this is hard. I'm here. I care about you. And the final step is to really recognize that you're not alone, that you're not the only one who has a chronic illness or who's struggling with their children or who feels stressed all the time, right? That it's kind of this common humanity that we share. And I'll be honest, that's one of the most powerful parts of mindfulness and self-compassion. When I was working with a woman with breast cancer, I remember she had 2 young kids. The diagnosis was devastating. And we started with mindfulness, noticing her fear, her anger, her anxiety. And then we practiced kind of being kind to herself like she would treat a dear friend, but nothing was really helping. And then we went to, well, let's think about all the other moms who have been diagnosed with breast cancer right now. And just to know that you're not alone, just sending them your compassion. And as she sent out her compassion to these other women, and then she would breathe it back to herself. And all of a sudden, something shifted, right? I'm not alone. And actually, there's this kind of sense of being empowered by, I can still offer compassion and I can actually offer that back to myself.
And, you know, in all of your research and studying, why are we so hard on ourselves? You know, because it seems to be rather universal. You know, you can't just say, oh, well, this was my upbringing or,
Right.
you know, this was my nuclear family. You know, why
Right.
is it? I mean, I've experienced this as I've been, you know, doing more of this in my own life. You know, how much easier it is to give that compassion to somebody else than it is to ourselves, right? I mean, it took you having her focusing on other people who were in her same state, which
Yes.
she could clearly identify with, and then very easily give compassion to them because she knew what it felt like herself. So,
Yes.
yeah, I mean,
It's so hard to offer it to ourselves.
right.
Your question is, why evolutionarily did we, you know, why is the design this way? And what I will say is, I don't know. And, you know, if you think about it, so healthy remorse is actually really important evolutionarily. It's important when I hurt someone that I feel the pain of it, where I'm like, darn it, ouch, I wish I hadn't done that. So I think what happens is we feel healthy remorse, and then what happens is we spiral into toxic shame. And so what I teach my patients is when you're feeling healthy remorse, how do you spiral up? How do you repair? How do you have compassion, both for yourself and for other people? And if you think about it, you know, thinking, for example, is not a bad thing, but thinking often is what creates anxiety, right? When it turns into chronic worry. So there's a lot of things evolutionarily that work well until they kind of get out of balance. And I would say shame and self-judgment is just when healthy remorse gets toxic.
And you've alluded to this in several of the examples that you've given, but, you know, really, how has this shaped your clinical practice, and how do you incorporate this into your clinical practice?
It has changed everything. I really have to say that. All of my research and clinical practice is shaped from this understanding of how do you create first a sense of safety in someone's nervous system, and then a sense of being on your own team. And for me, whether I'm working with my graduate students at the university, whether I'm working with patients or I'm designing a research study, those are the questions I'm always asking. How do I get people back on their own team and back into a sense of safety? Because I think we're living chronically afraid. I think people are in survival mode, and we need to learn how to shift back into a sense of thriving, where we feel safe within ourselves, we feel safe within our community, and safe within our world. And that doesn't mean that we don't acknowledge what's happening, because things in the world right now are very hard. And there's a way to have a sense of, no matter what, I will not abandon myself. I'm on my own team and I'm okay.
And now, you mentioned earlier that the research is showing just 5 minutes a day, you know, is creating changes in our brain. Is that what you're recommending to people? Is that really just a place to start? Is that the end goal, or is it one of those? 5 minutes affects it, but if you do 20 to 30 or even an hour a day, you would have that much more impact.
Right. So it all depends on how you're practicing. So if I'm forcing myself to do an hour a day and grinding myself and beating myself up, and it's like this, one more thing on my to-do list, am I really cultivating the attitude of compassion? Mm-hmm. Am I really creating more ease in my nervous system? No. So I tell people, start with 5 minutes a day, 5 days a week. And if you're like, ooh, I really want to practice more, go for it. If you don't. Again, we're learning how to shift our relationship with ourselves. That's the most important thing. That's really what meditation does. It shifts our relationship with ourselves, our relationship with the world, how we perceive things. And so I start people 5 minutes a day, 5 days a week. I encourage people to practice first thing in the morning because our brain is in a theta state, which means it's very suggestible, it's very trainable. And it also sets the trajectory of our day. So 5 minutes in the morning and or 5 minutes at night, because it's a wonderful way to wind down, to get your brain in a state where it can actually sleep more deeply and peacefully.
And this is the meditative practice that we're doing for the 5 minutes, which is separate from the actual mindfulness that we would have throughout the day. So speaking to that meditative practice, what do you have people just focus on the breath work? Having, just a blank mind? Do you have them, focusing on any type of mantra? Yeah. What type of practice?
There's thousands of meditation practices. It's like if you said, when you go to the gym, do you just do biceps?
Right.
Right. There's lots of different muscles groups that we need to exercise. So when I'm doing research, it depends what my target goal is. And then I will design the meditation for that. When I'm working with patients, it depends what they're bringing to me, and we will learn specific meditations for that. Having said that, you need to have a foundation of mindfulness so that you can train your attention, so that you can choose where to put it. If you can't even, that's really your scalpel. That's your tool. You need to train the tool. So there's basic mindfulness practices. I have a YouTube channel where you can have a bunch of free meditations, and there's basic breath meditations. There's basic kind of mental fitness, training your attention. And then once you've trained your attention, maybe you need to work on self-compassion. Maybe you need to work on gratitude. Maybe you're lonely and you need to work on a sense of being interdependent. There's lots of different meditations for the specific things we're working on.
Great. So do you want to mention your YouTube channel now? And we'll also mention everything.
I know it. Something with Dr. Shauna Shapiro, but I'll also, when you can link it.
Yes, absolutely. And I know you've written a number of books, 3 books. So do you want to tell us about those? And do you have also similar, breath practices or meditations in your books?
Yes. So my newest book is called Good Morning, I Love You, Mindfulness and Self-Compassion Practices to Rewire the Mind. And this book is really filled with science-based practices to help people change, along with story and hopefully to make it a little more digestible. What's interesting about this book is when it's been published now in 27 languages, and in all over Europe, the title was shifted to Rewire Your Mind. Apparently, Good Morning, I Love You does not translate. Even into British in London, it was called Rewire Your Mind. And I appreciate that, though, because the whole idea of the book is not just to kind of motivate and inspire people. It's to actually teach them these tools where they can shift and re-architect the very structure of their brain. And so I really encourage people when they read the book, because I'm a big reader, I like to underline, but also to get the Audible, because I read out the meditation so you can actually follow along. And the idea behind the book is transformation. Like we actually want you to learn these new skills so that at the end of it, you feel more resourced.
And so when somebody, if they're new to this, how, and of course, I know everybody's an individual. It would always be difficult when people say, well, how long will it take me to get well? What does this road look like? But so everybody's an individual, but in general, how long should it be before people really start to notice some shifts in their lives and their mind and their nervous system?
So we see brain changes in about 4 to 6 weeks of practice, depending on the practice. With loving kindness practice, it's a little more a concentration meditation, we see faster changes in the brain, but 4 to 6 weeks. But I would say within one time of practicing, all of a sudden you're going to notice things. You're going to notice your thoughts. You're going to notice sounds that you didn't hear before. It's almost like you're waking yourself up from automatic pilot, where we've been going through the motions so fast. And all of a sudden you're like, oh, this is my life. Here I am. And I think people start to see changes pretty immediately.
And then when it comes to the, actual mindfulness and going throughout your day, can you sort of walk us through what maybe that kind of looks like? And you're a parent. You mentioned, I think, 4 teenagers that you're a parent to. What does that look like in your house? And are they kind of grasping like, oh, mom does this really cool stuff? And or are they like, stay away, we don't want to hear anything about mindfulness?
Well, I have to say I'm very fortunate. So I'm remarried, and my biological son was always like, Mom, get the meditation away from me. I want nothing to do with that. And then my stepchildren became really interested in it. And what's been so lovely is I think their interest over the years now, my son has kind of come around, and we practice together. In fact, we practice together as a family. And it's pretty extraordinary. And I feel very, very blessed. And it doesn't always go that way. So for many years with my son, he thought it was strange and crazy. But to get back to your question of how do you practice throughout your daily life, the most important thing is setting an intention. Okay, setting an intention to be present, because when we set intentions, they're not just vague psychological concepts. Intentions are neurochemicals. So when I set an intention about something I care about, right? I want to be more present with my kids, or I want to be more present at work. What happens is we release dopamine, again, that neuromodulator of motivation. That makes sense. I care about this. We release this motivation, and dopamine turns into acetylcholine. Acetylcholine helps us focus our attention. So I always encourage people when they wake up, set that intention, right? May I be present? May I be kind and curious as I go out throughout my day? And then the other big thing is begin again. You're going to forget. You're going to get on automatic pilot. You're going to snap at your kids. You're going to do something wrong. Instead of beating yourself up and being like, oh my God, I can't believe my mind's been spaced out this whole day. I've wasted my morning. You say, oh, I get to begin again. You celebrate the fact that you're present, that you've woken back up from the trance. And then you start to kind of savor the small moments where you're having a cup of tea and you actually smell it and taste it. And there's this sense of being awake. Really, that's what mindfulness is about. It's not about being peaceful or happy, because sometimes we are and sometimes we're not. It's about being present with whatever is happening.
Yeah. I mean, it's a level of consciousness, right? Of just not going through the day, but, noticing your surroundings, the weather, the smells, the sounds, things like that.
Yeah.
And have you utilized and perhaps, any types of, well, let me just say it outright. Another buzzword these days is psychedelics and other sort of, whether they're plant medicines to synthetic medicines that are helping people to maybe rid themselves of the ego or to be more present. Has, any of your research delved into that area?
Yeah. So for me, the key is to open up neuroplastic windows, to really, again, for me, the name of the game is transformation. And so I've kind of looked at 2 different possibilities. And one of them includes psychedelics, which is we know that things like psilocybin or ketamine can kind of create this neuroplastic window where we can then put in these wonderful resources of mindfulness and self-compassion. So I think that's an area of research that's incredibly important. I'm so glad so many rigorous, randomized controlled trials are underway. I think it makes a lot of sense. The other direction I've gone in is to start teaching mindfulness younger, to children who their brain is plastic. Literally, it's in that theta state that we talked about, that our brain is in the morning all the time. I mean, they're basically hypnotizable for like the first 7 or 8 years. And so last year I wrote a children's book on kind of neuroplasticity and self-compassion, so that it could become normalized for our children at a very young age to start saying, good morning, I love you to themselves, and to start treating themselves with kindness, and to start to kind of separate from that judgmental mind, to notice that, oh, that's that judgment thing, right? And to really start to choose the quality of their attention and their attitude. So, but again, the key to all of this is, how do you use this miracle of neuroplasticity in a positive way, right?
Yes, no, I'm glad you brought up children, because, I'm an older mom. I have a 7.5-year-old at home, and I have a wellness room, and she goes in to pretend to meditate, because she sees me doing it and stuff. Yes, please.
7 is like our perfect, it's such an important age. It's great. I'm so excited for her.
I know. I mean, I wish I could, get it in the schools, and just the idea of, being able to settle her mind. And, you as a mom, we know that you can go one of two ways, right? When we do this type of work, my mother was very into homemade foods. Luckily, I, attached onto that and ate very healthfully growing up. But you don't know if your kid's going to rebel and go the other way. But I'll take my chances and, see what I can do.
And here's what I would say about our children, because I think it would be wonderful if we could get this into schools. And in fact, we raised a bunch of money with the children's book, and we donated it to children's hospitals and schools around the country, so now it's just there in the waiting room for children, whoever wants to read it. But here's what I'll say as parents. You can't force anything. We know that, right? But we can model it, so that if my child gets upset and I can regulate my own nervous system instead of freaking out, trying to regulate theirs, the first step is I just show them, oh, this is what I do when I'm scared. This is how I breathe. This is how I calm myself down. And when we don't get afraid of their emotions, right? Because so often as parents, we're like, oh my God, my child's in pain, I want to fix it. When we just say, it's okay, I'm right here. And emotions rise up and pass away. In fact, they only last 30 to 90 seconds. So let's ride this wave and see what happens. And as your child starts to realize, oh, I'm still okay. It's, the anxiety went away. They start to build that sense of trust and safety. And again, bringing it back to safety. How do we regulate the nervous system?
Yeah. I mean, just in, my recently becoming more engaged in mindfulness and whatnot myself, I have been able to regulate my emotions better. And, it's, as many have said, it's the oxygen mask. You put it on yourself first and then deal with your child when there's a stressful situation. Look, I'm by no means perfect. We all have, our moments, but certainly much better. And then referring back to the, when your child is going through something painful or something's happened to them, my daughter was saying, something happened at school, and somebody I follow on social media was saying, instead of trying to pull them off the bench, sit on the bench with them,
Yeah.
And so I was just saying, oh, that must have been really hurtful. How did it feel? Or what did you do? Or, and then, the example was that then they'll get up running from the bench before, you're even ready to get up from the bench. And I found that to be true, as well.
It's so important. And what's interesting as parents, so we care so much about our kids. And what happens when we see them in pain is we empathize with their pain. We're like, oh, that must have really sucked. But what happens when we feel empathy is it lights up the pain centers in our brain. So we're kind of traumatizing ourselves on a, subacute level. And if we stay there, we're not really regulated and able to help our kids. And so one of the things that I teach parents, truthfully, and therapists and physicians and anyone that works in trauma, is empathy is the first step. But then you want to open up into compassion, which is, I care, I love you, and really focusing on what your hope for that person is instead of on their pain. So you focus on the love and not the pain. And this amazing research out of Switzerland showed that when we feel compassion, the reward centers, the neural circuitry of joy lights up in our brain. So we're actually wearing like a protective suit. When we're in empathy, we're just jamming the pain centers full. And so it's really important to use empathy as a gateway to compassion with our kids.
So I think that's excellent. And that's one of the things that I've certainly have discovered about myself, that, I was definitely taking on a lot of other people's pains and dramas and traumas seriously as if they were my own.
Yes.
And then realizing that this really was other people's. And so I know you did just explain it, but can we just dive a little bit deeper in that? Because I think it's a little bit hard to distinguish empathy from compassion. And how do you make that leap? I mean, I know you just described it, but it's still, I feel like I'm caught in it. And so how do we, particularly those of us, that are practitioners people, that was my next word, that we're feeling all of this. How do we do that without taking it on?
Yes, it's such a great question. So what the medical field tried to do is they were like, well, just don't care and just numb yourself. That didn't work. Yeah. So what I'm saying is actually the opposite. I'm saying feel the pain and then go in deeper and feel your love for that person. Because the reason you're feeling pain is because you love your daughter so much. And you're like, oh, I love you. I want what's best for you. So go use the pain as a signal, right? We have this beautiful mirror neuron system. So if I bite into a sour lemon, it's going to make you, have that sour taste. So that's helping us empathize. But don't get stuck there. Don't keep replaying the sour lemon in your mouth and how much she must have hurt and how horrible it was. Mm-hmm. Go into my love for my daughter. What am I hoping for? Oh, I hope you get included next time. I hope that you learn how to regulate your emotions. I hope that you're peaceful. And there's a way in which, as we shift into our compassion and our care and this kind of energy of forward momentum of how can I help, it's much more protective for ourselves and much more effective for whoever we're working with, whether it be our patients or our children. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense? So in my book, there's a chapter that is how to transform empathy into compassion. Mm-hmm. And you literally have to practice it and hardwire it into your brain because it's hard, right? Mm-hmm. It's easy for us to get stuck in the empathy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Definitely. I think, again, particularly those of us, as practitioners, and I was more speaking to, I actually have a pretty good ability to not take on my daughter's pain because in a certain kind of way, it's like she's 7, I'm in my 50s, it's hard to relate. But, certainly when I'm dealing with patients or friends, I'm of the age that many people are getting diagnosed with lots of different conditions. And so it's really hard to, not take that on.
Yeah. So I worked for a long time at the cancer center. So my, the women that I worked with had breast cancer, and it was a very painful environment. And the way that I survived was as I would feel their pain, I would shift into my caring for them. And it would activate this neural circuitry of compassion. How can I help? How can I support? I care about you. I care about your pain. It's okay to care about their pain. It shifts from feeling their pain, right? And being suffocated by the pain.
Now, are there any, you've shared one or two already, but any success stories that you'd like to share with us of, clients that you've worked with, people in your book?
Yes. I have to say, it's so heartening, the number of letters I get from the book, just hearing about people's different stories and being a clinician and working with people and watching them transform. I mean, I feel so grateful because truthfully for me, it re-inspires me. It motivates me to practice, that in fact, both the science, like looking at the data and being like, wow, this really works. This really lengthens your telomeres. Like, okay, I'll practice. And also watching people transform. And I will say one of the people that stands out to me the most was this, he was in the military, actually. He was a high-ranking officer, and he had a lot of anger issues. So he was mandated to a mindfulness program because it's now made its way to the military, which I think is a good thing. Yeah. But he wasn't very excited to be there, you can imagine. He was like, what's this mindfulness stuff? And we had him reflect on his intention. And as he thought about what was important to him, why he was there, he was like, you know what? My anger is actually causing problems at home too. I probably should manage it better. And so he really set an intention that was authentic. It wasn't fake, right? And so then he started practicing in earnest. And about a month into the training, he shared this story. He said he was at the grocery store and he had his cart full of groceries and he was just about to check out when this older woman carrying a young baby girl stepped right in front of him. And she kind of cut, and he, was mad. So he was about to say something, get mad, but then he remembered his intention and he took a breath and he calmed down. But an instant later, the woman and the young checkout clerk were like cooing and awing over the baby girl. And the woman handed the baby girl to the checkout clerk for a hug. And he almost exploded in anger. He's like, are you kidding? Is this a nursery? What are you doing? But he took a breath and he remembered his intention and he calmed himself down. And he noticed the little girl was pretty cute. Another moment later, she's in the arms of the woman. They walk out the door of the grocery store. And as the young checkout clerk is ringing up his groceries, he looks at her and he's like, that little girl is pretty cute. And she says to him, oh, really? Thank you. That was my daughter.
Oh.
She says, my husband died a few months ago and I had to go back to work. And so my mom brings my daughter through my lane every day for a hug.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you just feel how everything changes in that moment and how grateful he was that he had learned to regulate his emotions, to pause and to choose his response instead of just automatically reacting.
Right. Now, for somebody like that, you mentioned he had been in the military. I mean, he may have had, a very extensive background of seeing, violent, traumatic things.
Mm-hmm.
Do you find that, just this mindfulness can make these shifts? Is it, I guess where does all of that stored trauma and the things that he saw go?
Right. So I never believe that one thing is a magic bullet, right? There is no one cure-all. That mindfulness with healthy nutrition and good sleep and a supportive, social network, including sometimes medication and sometimes perhaps in the future we'll have psychedelics. Like, I think it's a whole kind of environment that we're creating for health. And so I would never say that meditation is the one magic bullet. I would say it's a powerful tool. And my hope is to teach it to as many people as possible.
Yes. Well, definitely. Well, what is on the horizon for you? Can you share anything with your research, or I know you just recently launched a book. Do you have anything else coming out, or where are you focusing your research these days?
Yes. So, I'm really interested in making this accessible. So for me, it's how do we make these tools so simple and so clear that we could teach it to a 5-year-old, we could teach it to a teenager, we could teach it to someone who's going through addiction recovery. And so I'm really using my research and the science to refine how do we best translate? How do we best teach this to people? How do I take what I learned in the monastery and what I've done for the last 25 years in science and kind of give people the most accessible way to access this resource that is free and really available to everyone? Oh, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, our attention is our most valuable resource, and it can be trained. And what that does is it wakes you up to choice. You're like, where do I want to focus? Do I want to focus on gratitude in this moment? Do I want to focus on the smell of my tea? Or do I want to loop about what's happening in the future and what am I going to do? And all of a sudden you wake up and you have choice, just like the officer did in the grocery store, where he had choice. Instead of automatically reacting, he chose to notice the little girl was pretty cute.
No, it's definitely, and I think the other side of that coin is, you don't know what other people are going through. So, I think that's an enormous lesson. Yes. Every day, particularly this day and age with everything that people have going on. Yeah. Have you been back to the monastery at all? Have you ever gone back and done another retreat? And how differently was that?
I couldn't believe how small it was. I remember it being enormous and expansive, and it was quite small. I've been back to Thailand a number of times. I really love that country, and I've done some work with the King of Thailand and the royal family and how to integrate kind of Eastern Buddhist practices with Western science. So yeah, it's a special place in my heart.
And I imagine your experience going back, and did you sit in meditation? And I imagine that was much easier this time around.
It's never easy, but I think I had the container for when hard things come up. I remember one of my meditation teachers said, like, if you haven't cried on a retreat, you're not really practicing, because all of us are carrying pain. There's no possible way that we don't have some trauma and some pain that needs to be relieved. And that was the question you asked about the officer in the military, is like, what happens to that stored trauma? And that's why I think it's so important, that we exercise, that we incorporate different movement practices, that we incorporate, nutrition, that we incorporate practices to regulate the nervous system and regulate the vagus nerve. Like, I think that there's so much integrative care that we need.
No, absolutely. Well, before we part ways, I'd like to ask our guest, what are 3 ways you would encourage our listeners to take back their health?
First, most important is to know that change is possible, that it's possible for you to be healthy. And I think one of the first things they taught us in graduate school is the number one predictor of whether or not your patient is going to change is whether or not they believe they can. And so for me, neuroplasticity is the most hopeful message we could have had in the last 400 years of brain science, because it says change is possible. So that's the first, change is possible. The second thing is you can begin again. It's never too late. You've never made too many mistakes. You've never messed up so much that you can begin again in this moment, because this moment matters. This moment is shaping your brain. And I think the third thing is we're never just practicing for ourselves, that everything we do ripples out, that we're part of this incredibly beautiful interdependent world. And when we start to realize we're not alone, I think it brings so much strength and so much health.
I love all of those. I particularly love, the second one that you mentioned, and just, I think not getting discouraged and just using every opportunity as a moment to, as you said, start again.
Yeah.
And that the work is probably never done.
Never.
Unless maybe you're the Dalai Lama, but then still it's probably not done.
No. Perfection is not possible, but transformation is.
Yes, I love that. And so where can our listeners find you if they're interested? I know you're going to send us your YouTube channel, their social website.
Dr. Shauna Shapiro at Dr. Shauna Shapiro. My webpage is drshaunaShapiro.com. And on my webpage, I have a number of meditations as well. And I always respond to people's questions. So if you send me an email on my webpage, I promise I will respond.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for taking time with us. It was great to get to know you and to hear more about mindfulness. And thanks for helping change the world.
Thank you.
I want to thank this week's guests for sharing their time and knowledge, and thank you for listening. To read the full show notes for each episode, which include a summary, timestamp, quotes, and any resources mentioned, please visit amymyersmd.com/podcast. Lastly, if you've enjoyed this episode, I'd love if you would leave a rating and a review on Apple or Spotify, and we'll select a few to read out loud in a future episode. Tune in next week to hear from another inspiring guest as we help you take back your health.